Hey, this is Nem. So today we're going to be talking about a message that I have for all of you about Dawntrail, and that is that Dawntrail is going to be a successful expansion that's fondly remembered. And you might think there's no way. Dawntrail has been awful. There's a content drought. Things are bleak and hopeless. Between people hating on Wuklamot, hating on the story, to being bored and unsubbing, seeing the numbers go down, the lowest they've been since Shadowbringers. What can we do? How can this be a good thing? And now that we have the player run survey, or not survey, but what's it called? I can't think of the word right now, but the player run metrics based on web scraping the lodestone to figure out roughly based on like achievement status, how many active players there are now compared to the 0.1x expansion patches of days gone by. And what we're seeing, I'm sure you've probably seen like the Zeppla reaction video, right? Saying that players are down to pre-Stormblood levels. And I think that's fair. So let's talk about the landscape. And then we're going to get into my spreadsheets here a little bit in a second. So if you remember, back before Shadowbringers came out, we had Stormblood. And I usually compare Dawntrail right now as a fresh start to the story, and thus, in a way, the story is like akin to that of ARR, right? It's a new beginning, a lot of world building, character building, stuff like that. But realistically, even if the story is more akin to ARR in that regard, the expansion as a whole is probably most akin to Stormblood. When we talk about content, things to do, that sort of thing, whether it's a good, fun expansion or not, realistically, that's the closest comparison, because any other comparison isn't really that fair. Aside from job balance and job design, which really is Shadowbringers, the third coming of Shadowbringers. Because, you had Shadowbringers revamp the jobs. Then you had Endwalker just add 10 levels and a couple abilities to Shadowbringers jobs. And then after that, you had Dawntrail, which added 10 more levels and a couple of new abilities to Shadowbringer jobs. Right? So the job design is feeling a little stagnant at this point because we've seen the same thing. But for the content, that's really where people are upset. We notice that some of the job balance, like Blackmages, are people aren't the most happy about that. But for the most part, that's not really the pain point that people are complaining about. Oversimplification of jobs isn't our biggest issue right now. It's we don't have things to do, right? We're bored, we're unsubbing. What do you do in Final Fantasy XIV in 2025? So I wanted to examine the content cycle of Stormblood. Now, why did I pick Stormblood? The reason I picked Stormblood is because it most closely resembles our expected content types that we're supposed to get for Dawntrail. And we got those things in Stormblood. Now, Stormblood, if you look back on it, people remember it more fondly afterwards than they did at the time. But at the time, people were really bored by the story, which is similar to Dawntrail. It took a little too long. It was a little too back and forth. You had to world build one side. You had to world build the other side. You had characters here and there. And eventually it comes together. But if you're not super invested or find it super relatable, some of the character-specific stories like Tsukuyomi, right? You might sleep on Stormblood. Now, I personally think Stormblood's an amazing story and an amazing expansion. But there is a lot of minutia involved there. And honestly, there are some parts where you really got to slog it through some walls of text, right? But I still think it's a phenomenal story. A lot of people don't agree with that, and that's okay. But even though the story was meh, people remember the content of Stormblood forever. They find it to be one of the most content-rich, exciting times in 14's history, and I want to cover why that is, and I want to cover why the story of Stormblood's content cycle gives us hope and renewal in Dawntrail's content cycle. Because right now, the general player base feels like the formula is old, the formula is stagnant, it's not super exciting, it's boring. I want to show that even though I kind of agree with that doesn't mean we're not going to have a really good expansion for the rest of the expansion. That Dawntrail is not DEADtrail. All right. So let's get into this. This is my spreadsheet. We're going to go over major content releases that are not raids, because the raid cycle is exactly the same. Everybody knows about the Savages coming out. Everybody knows about the regular, the trials, all that crap, right? Dungeons, all that's exactly the same. So we don't really need to dig into that, because if that's all the content it took for us to like keep playing, I wouldn't have to make a video about this right now. But let's talk about the new specific changes that revitalized or introduced new content in a way that made the expansion memorable. If we go back to Stormblood, it launched on June 15th, 2017, right? For patch 4.0. I'm going to label that as new content because that'll kind of account for all the raids, the Savages throughout the expansion, all that stuff, right? Is that you get that one stamp of new content, okay? Now, something interesting, right off the bat with Stormblood, we had 2 instances of revived content. One of those instances is Solo Palace of the Dead becoming possible. So Solo Palace of the Dead floor 200, I believe, came out in 3.45 in Heavensward, where you like suddenly you didn't have 30 or, and I think it went from 50 floors, right? So the cap was originally 30 floors in Palace of the Dead. Then it became 50 floors, I believe, and then it jumped up to 200, not just 100. We got all the challenge floors and the second 50 to once, if I remember correctly. Don't quote me on it, unless you know that I'm right. Then definitely quote me on it. But what I'm saying is, we got all those floors, but nobody could beat it solo. It was group content, four-player group content for clearing Palace of the Dead, and it wasn't until Stormblood hit that we got sustaining potions. Now, sustaining potions are your self-healing potion. It's the thing that makes Palace of the Dead soloable, right? It's the thing that gets you through it. You couldn't get Necromancer as a title before Stormblood, so instantly, patch 4.0 drops, even if you don't care about leveling up a new character. If you just play this game for Deep Dungeon, where there's a lot of people who that's all they do, right? Palace of the Dead is now completely revived. Not that it was dead, but it was very small and niche, and solo Palace of the Dead was almost non-existent. Very small, dedicated player base did solo Palace of the Dead back then, trying to figure out how to get it done. And finally now it just explodes with this, wow, Palace of the Dead has sustaining potions. This is a massive change. You can go so far now. And that's when we start seeing Red Mage players really starting to take Palace of the Dead solo seriously and really make those progress. And I think it was shortly thereafter that we got our first clear, but I don't really remember for sure. But the point is, Deep Dungeon immediately off the bat was revived, and then secondarily they did a PvP revamp where the fold became the feast, and we used to have PvE actions, like our regular job attacks were available in PvP. They got rid of that in 4.0, and now you had PvP specific actions, right? So right off the bat, 2 forms of content instantly revived. If you ever tried to PvP in Heavensward and you got like the dead queues where everybody was like a monk at the time, I think it was like everyone's like a monk, or maybe it was ninja or something, I don't remember, but it was really, really hard to grind PvP because the queues were always dead, and this did bring new life to it. Now, it didn't bring new life like how we saw Crystalline Conflict bring new life more recently in Endwalker, but it did revitalize. I remember very strongly people being excited for PvP when 4.0 came out. So right off the bat, we have 2 new revived contents, and then roughly 4 months later, in October, we got our first ultimate, UCOB. So immediately you're looking at Stormblood and you're saying, okay, so they did go 4 months without really anything new other than the Savages, but they did get a new ultimate. All right, that sounds familiar, right? Dawntrail launching in June as well. And then when do we get through? November. Oops, it took a little bit longer, an extra month. Ooh, that doesn't feel good, but it's not that far different, right? So let's take a look here. I did introduce some things that aren't really important to this story, but are kind of fun to remember. So Bard music coming out with patch 4.15, right? That was in Stormblood. I call it Revival Wings. Rival Wings in PvP also comes out. So the thing I did notice about both Dawntrail and Stormblood, and really just Final Fantasy in general, is that they are constantly iterating on and balancing PvP. PvP gets a lot of love and attention on the balance side of things. And even if on the content side, it kind of stagnated and starved for a while. So PvP does have a dedicated team that's like really passionate about that. And so if you're a PvPer, you're really eating well, I would say, because just constant balance, constant additions or changes, that seems to be a staple. So PvPers are PvPing, right? Rival Wings coming in was new content. Ironically, in 4.2, Castrum, well, not ironically, but funnily enough, this is when cutscenes became unskippable for MSQ dungeons. I think that's really funny to remember. But if we take a step back and remember that we are in Dawntrail 7.16 right now, if we do the equivalent of 4.15 in Stormblood, they are up to November 2017, 5 months since the expansion came out. And we are in a similar boat here, where Dawntrail came out in June, and here we are in January, 7 months later. So a little bit longer than that, which doesn't feel that good. But let's fast forward 7 months. They got 4.2 in January, right? So when we get our 4.2, we're lagging behind just a little bit. We're almost there, right? And that's the important thing to notice. Why Dawntrail is still going to succeed and be a good expansion. Because believe me, I like to doom on Dawntrail just as much as the other guy. It hasn't been the greatest experience. But I think what we're going to see is a slow to start, but then it finishes strong. Check this out. When 4.2 hits, you get Eureka. The first Eureka zone in 4.25, right? So that's March. Quite a ways out, right? Still a couple months between these two. That doesn't feel all that good. There is a raid tier to remember in there, so we'll get a raid tier, and then we'll probably see an exploration zone come out, right? So that's really important. Once Eureka hits, everything changes. Now, people were really unhappy with Eureka when it first came out. They do eventually nerf it, so take that as you will. Our exploration zone will probably have a lot more success than the original Eureka did. But the first zone comes out in Animos, right? And then we see a second ultimate in June the following year. So 1 year into the expansion, and you have 2 ultimates. You have an exploration's first zone. You have a new PvP mode, all right? And Palace of the Dead has been revived for solo play, because now the Necromancer is a coveted and rare, almost impossible title to get. Nobody knows how to get it, really, except like 1 or 2 people at this point. Pretty crazy, right? And in fact, maybe nobody has it cleared by year. I don't know the exact timeline, but it's there, that carrot on the stick, right? That's content to do, you know? So I think that's very, very interesting for the first year. If we keep going in Stormblood, right, we see crossroad link shells get introduced. So just to kind of see a little bit of the history, we did get crossroad link shells just before getting our second ultimate. And then they added a second deep dungeon. Now, interesting, the deep dungeon players were eating very well in Stormblood, because you had solo POTD, now you had Heaven on High, and thus also solo Heaven on High. There was a lot of cool stuff to do for deep dungeon players in Stormblood. After that, of course, right, in August, we get Eureka's second zone, and then it's pretty quiet, except I think for a raid tier, third raid tier. Until 4.45 in November, where we had Eureka's third zone. And then, unexpectedly, we got Blue Mage. And Blue Mage, while criticized a little bit because people were against the idea of being alone and not really understanding that it's not an endgame job, like in 11, expectations were a little off. People loved Blue Mage. People still love Blue Mage. Right, so getting a whole new job for Blue Mage was a huge win, because you also got the Masked Carnival for endgame Blue Mage. This was huge new content. I added it as a new feature, though it really is content. They added Mahjong, but just so few people invest in Mahjong that I'll keep it as a neat feature. You know what I mean? But honestly, for a lot of people, well, for a few people, like, they just play Mahjong. They really love this, and I think that's cool. Finally, we get Eureka's fourth zone. Okay, so when we recapped on Stormblood, we got 4 exploration zones, a deep dungeon, 2 ultimates, a new extra job, right? We got a new PvP mode, and we got a revival of Palace of the Dead solo and PvP in general from the revamp. Keep that in mind. So in Dawntrail, let's take a look at where we are now. Dawntrail launches. We get really just a bunch of neat features, right? The 2-channel die system, the graphics update, blacklist updates. The really only revived content that we got is Unreal Trials carryover from Endwalker. We're still getting Unreal Trials, new ones. Okay, cool, right, awesome. That's a thing that people like to do, and the rewards are actually kind of fun. We got Hall of the Novice updates, again, another new feature. But for content, right, we got Fru, and now we have the Chaotic Alliance raid. The Chaotic Alliance raid being an unexpected wild card for people, right? And that is about 7 months into the expansion. So it feels kind of dead, even though Chaotic is actually taking off and very popular. People really like Chaotic. It's just been like a dry season. You know what I mean? And on top of that, back in Stormblood, a lot of players had not done all the ARR and Heavensward content. Now they have, right? So old content was more valuable back in those days, whereas nowadays it's less valuable. Things are kind of exhausted in a way for a lot of veteran players. Even players who started in Shadowbringers are finding that they've done everything now over the course of the last few expansions, right? So this is the situation we're in. But I think it draws a neat comparison. If we go to my other spreadsheet, right? This is my other one. It doesn't look pretty. But if we look at new content to date, so how much new content did Stormblood versus Dawntrail introduce as of this patch, as of before 4.2 and before 7.2? They both had 3. And if we look back on that, what were the 3, right? So we'll count the launch of the expansion as 1. We're going to get UCOB, and we're going to get Rival Wings. So a new PvP mode and an ultimate raid. What did we get in Dawntrail? Well, we did not get a new PvP mode, but we did get the Chaotic Alliance raid. I don't know. Yeah, and Fru, right? Fru, the expansion launch itself, Fru, and the Chaotic raid. So an ultimate, both got an ultimate, and then both got something else. I would say Chaotic is a lot better than Rival Wings, but I don't want to upset the PvPers too much. But in my opinion, Chaotic is way more popular and way more rewarding and way more just, it's like always going to be a thing, you know what I mean? And we'll get more Chaotics in the future. I think that's better, right? So I think Dawntrail in 7.2 onward should start taking off. And we'll cover this because now let's look. The one thing is in the revived content to date field, right? So Stormblood did revive Palace of the Dead and it did revive PvP. Dawntrail does not need to revive PvP because we revived PvP in Endwalker, so it's not totally a fair comparison. But it did revive, I would say, or continues, right, the Unreal Trials, which we didn't have Unreal Trials in Stormblood. So content-wise, all right, at least we have Unreal Trials, which people do enjoy. A lot of the casual player base makes it a point to run those every week, And then on top of that, we didn't need to revive PvP because PvP is not dead, because PvP seasons are coming and going and coming and going, and we're getting the not just the ranked seasons like we got in Stormblood, we also get the casual reward, like just play PvP and get reward season, with the the minions and like the borders and like the glams, right? That's brand new. And so PvP is doing well in Dawntrail, right? So because of that, we do have one less revived content, but that's because PvP didn't need to be revived. PvP was like dead before Stormblood. Like between Heavensward and Stormblood, it was dead. You literally could not find a match. And that's not true anymore, right? So that's a sign of better game design, better system design. They've succeeded in PvP, right? So let's take a look at post X.1 content for new plus revived, released versus expected. What does that mean? We're going to look at the new content that happened after 4.15 that were released in Stormblood and the revived content. We got 7 for Stormblood instances of brand new content that makes it so when we look back at at our time in Stormblood, we remember it fondly. We remember we were having fun doing new things. 7 was the benchmark. In Dawntrail, we can expect at least 3, but with like an asterisk there. And we'll talk about that. The things that we're expecting in Dawntrail right now are very similar to that in Stormblood. We're expecting a new deep dungeon. We're expecting a new exploration zone, which should be at least 3 zones, maybe 4. We're hoping for 4, but we'll see. We don't know. We're expecting Beastmaster as a new job, akin to how Stormblood got Bluemage. And then we're expecting some unpromised things that there seems to be room in development for them, but we don't know. We haven't been given promises, and those unpromised things are a second ultimate. So instead of just Fru getting one more, but we don't know if that's going to happen. But if we don't get it, if we have another Shadowbringers where it was just T, I think we're going to feel like Dawntrail didn't have enough content. But if we do get a second new ultimate, or maybe a second new chaotic raid, something, I think we're going to feel like there's not enough content. And then, of course, 3 to 4 zones is part of the exploration. So if the exploration zone was 4, we would be seeing potentially 6 new forms of content by the end of Dawntrail, but potentially up to 10 new content and 1 revived versus 10 new and 2 revived for the total of Stormblood. And again, reviving Palace of the Dead and reworking PvP is an unfair comparison because those were kind of just like in the moment things. We revived PvP in Endwalker, so of course it's not going to get revived in Dawntrail. It doesn't need to be because it's not dead. And then also Palace of the Dead got revived through solo via sustaining potions because it actually became possible to solo. And I think that even though people soloed it before, no one was clearing solo Palace of the Dead. It actually became like, I can get through this? Holy crap. And it just spawned this solo deep dungeon community that is thriving today, right? So my point is, after this long-winded explanation, is that Dawntrail has hope, guys. Dawntrail can still be very good, especially if Beastmaster is incredibly popular. If Beastmaster comes out swinging like the Final Fantasy of Pokemon comes out here and like it just pops off, that's gonna be the turning point where we say Dawntrail was a great expansion. I loved Dawntrail. Even if the story is weak, a lot of people look at Stormblood and they say, I didn't like the story. But we loved the content. The Alliance raids were kick-ass. And so far we've seen the Alliance raids in Dawntrail being kick-ass. The battle content is kick-ass. The dungeons are really good. The raids are really good. The ultimate is fantastic. Battle content is so fun right now. And if we get a fun deep dungeon in an incredibly fun exploration zone with relic weapons and a new progression system, right? This is going to be a good expansion. It is lined up to be really good, but we are in the dry season. So that's my message to everybody. I don't have too much more to say about it. I'm not going to tell you to stop complaining because believe me, I complain too. But I am going to say, hey, if you need to unsub and come back, that's cool. If you're going to stick it out, fantastic. But I think there are really, really fun things coming. And I think as long as you partake in some of the upcoming content, in this expansion, I think you're going to remember Dawntrail fondly, even if you're someone who hates Wuklamot, even if you hate the story, right? I think you're going to like Dawntrail. All right, that's it for me, everybody. Until next time, this is Nem. See ya.